There is a man out there, right now, who started as a driver for the Mexican Navy, became the most feared enforcer for the most powerful drug lord on the planet, and then said, "Nah, I'm starting my own cartel." A man so dangerous that when the Mexican military's secret files got hacked and his name showed up on their most wanted list, they put his face next to 5 other targets. And he was the one keeping generals up at night. A man who built his empire in one of the most strategic ports in all of Mexico, running fentanyl and meth precursors, flooding into the United States. His name is Carlos Enrique Martinez Cuesta. The streets know him as El Marino, El Mayo's most trusted, most lethal, most dangerous lieutenant. And here's the thing, most people have never even heard of him, until now. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're gonna understand why this man might be the most interesting figure in the entire Sinaloa cartel story that nobody's talking about. No cap. Alright, before we get into it, let me set the scene. We're talking about the Sinaloa cartel, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the history of the world. We're talking about an organization that has moved literal tons of cocaine, heroin, meth, and fentanyl into the United States for decades. An organization that had its hands in Chicago, Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles, Arizona, everywhere. And at the top of that organization, for longer than most people can remember, sat 2 names, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Now El Chapo, everybody knows El Chapo, the tunnels, the Netflix show, the trial in Brooklyn, the life sentence. El Chapo became a legend. But here's what most people don't realize. El Mayo was always the smarter one, the quieter one, the one who never got caught, the one who kept the machine running while El Chapo was out making headlines and getting recaptured. El Mayo ran the logistics, paid the bribes, sometimes up to $1 million a month, and kept the whole operation invisible. And the man he trusted most to enforce that invisibility, to make sure nobody talked, nobody crossed the line, nobody threatened the operation, that was El Marino. And the story of how a Mexican Navy driver became El Mayo's most feared weapon and then built his own cartel from scratch is one of the craziest things happening in the criminal underworld right now. Let me break it down for you. To understand El Marino, you gotta understand where he came from. Carlos Enrique Martinez Cuesta wasn't born into the cartel life. He was a member of the Mexican military, specifically the Infanteria de Marina, which is essentially the Marine Corps of Mexico's Navy. He was trained, disciplined, and operating inside one of Mexico's most sensitive military structures. He was assigned as the driver and escort for the commander of the 6th Naval Region, based in Colima on Mexico's Pacific coast. Now think about what that means for a second. As a driver for a regional naval commander, this dude had access to classified movements, military intelligence, security protocols, base layouts, personnel schedules, all of it. He knew how the military thought. He knew how operations were planned. He knew how surveillance worked, how arrests were coordinated, how raids were executed. He was literally inside the machine. And then, at some point, somebody got to him. Or maybe he looked around and did the math himself. Because the cartel money in Colima wasn't subtle. Colima is one of the most violent and drug-saturated states in all of Mexico. It's a relatively small state, but it sits right on the Pacific coast, and its port city, Manzanillo, is one of the most important smuggling hubs in the entire country. The cartels run that port, and whoever controls Manzanillo controls a massive piece of the drug pipeline flowing north into the United States. So, somewhere along the line, Martinez Cuesta made a decision. He went AWOL. He deserted the Mexican Navy, which, by the way, is a serious federal crime in Mexico, and he crossed over to the other side. And not just any cartel, he went straight to the top. He went to the Sinaloa cartel. He went to El Mayo. Now here's where it gets interesting, because you gotta ask, why would El Mayo, the most careful, most secretive, most methodical drug lord alive, trust a former military man, especially one who deserted? The answer is simple, because that military training was exactly what El Mayo needed. El Mayo wasn't running some street-level operation. He was running a multinational criminal enterprise worth billions of dollars. He needed people who understood logistics, security, surveillance, and discipline, and a trained naval officer who knew how the Mexican military thought from the inside. That's not a liability. That's an asset. A massive one. This is where things started getting real. So Martinez Cuesta comes into the Sinaloa cartel's orbit, and he doesn't come in at the bottom. He rises fast because he's not like the other guys. While most cartel soldiers are learning on the job, this dude already knows operational security. He already knows how to move without being seen. He already knows how military intelligence tracks people, which means he already knows how to avoid being tracked. That knowledge, in the cartel world, it's worth more than almost anything. El Mayo, who, remember, managed to evade capture for decades while every law enforcement agency on the planet was looking for him, would have recognized that value immediately. El Mayo was a businessman first. He didn't run his operation on chaos. He ran it on systems, on planning, on the right people in the right places. And Martinez Cuesta, who they started calling El Marino, the Marine, fit perfectly into that system. El Marino became El Mayo's lieutenant, one of his most trusted operators. And in the Sinaloa cartel, trust at that level doesn't just mean you get a better cut of the money. It means you are the person who handles the things that cannot go wrong. You are the person El Mayo calls when there's a problem that needs to disappear, when there's a rival who needs to be dealt with, when there's a territory that needs to be secured. You are the enforcer, the fixer, the last line of defense for the entire operation. Now, documents from Mexican military intelligence leaked as part of the massive Guacamaya hack describe El Marino as a, quote, important operator in the criminal structure in Colima, and his base of operations was Manzanillo. Let me tell you why that matters so much. Manzanillo is not just a port city. It is one of the busiest commercial ports in all of Latin America. Thousands of shipping containers move through that port every single week. Containers from China, from South America, from all over the world, and hidden inside some of those containers, chemical precursors, the raw ingredients used to manufacture fentanyl and methamphetamine. You've probably heard a lot about the fentanyl crisis hitting the United States right now, the tens of thousands of overdose deaths every year. A significant piece of that supply chain runs directly through Manzanillo, right through El Marino's backyard. That's not a coincidence. El Mayo's operation had its hands in that port, and El Marino was one of the key figures making sure those shipments moved without interference. But here's where it gets crazy, because while El Marino is building his reputation and his power inside the Sinaloa cartel, the entire organization is about to go through the most dramatic transformation in its history. And it starts with El Chapo getting caught, January 2016. Mexican authorities, with support from U.S. intelligence, capture Joaquin El Chapo Guzman for the third and final time. In 2019, he's convicted in a Brooklyn federal court and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. No more El Chapo on the streets. Now, for El Mayo, this creates a complicated situation. On one hand, El Mayo, who had been running parallel operations alongside El Chapo for decades, is now effectively in full command of the entire Sinaloa cartel. He's the last man standing from the old guard, the OG, the one who survived everything. But on the other hand, El Chapo left behind sons, specifically Joaquin Guzman Lopez and Ovidio Guzman Lopez, who become known collectively as Los Chapitos. And Los Chapitos want their piece. They want control. They want to inherit their father's empire. And they're not just going to sit back and let El Mayo run everything. This is important because this tension, the Maiza faction versus the Chapitos faction, is what completely reshapes the Sinaloa cartel over the next several years. And El Marino is right in the middle of it. As one of El Mayo's most trusted lieutenants, he's aligned with the Maiza, but he's watching as this internal war starts to brew. And what he sees is chaos, infighting, political games inside the cartel, people getting pulled in different directions, alliances shifting, the whole organization starting to crack from the inside. And El Marino, with his military mind, with his operator's instinct, starts doing the math. He sees what's coming, and he makes a decision that almost nobody in the cartel world ever makes successfully. He decides to go independent. By 2022, according to leaked Mexican military intelligence documents, Carlos Enrique Martinez Cuesta, El Marino, has officially broken away from the Sinaloa cartel and formed his own criminal organization. He calls it Los Exiliados, the exiled. Think about that name for a second, the exiled. He's not calling himself the winners. He's not calling himself the kings. He's calling his people the ones who got pushed out, the ones who didn't fit, the ones who went their own way. There's something almost poetic about it. A man who deserted the Navy, worked for the world's biggest cartel, and then got out of that too, naming his crew after the experience of being cast out from both worlds. And where does he set up Los Exiliados? Right back in Manzanillo, right back in Colima. The territory he already knows better than anyone, the port he spent years operating in, the smuggling routes he helped build and protect for El Mayo. Now he's using all of that knowledge for himself. Now here is where things get truly crazy, and this is where the story of El Marino intersects with one of the biggest government scandals in Mexican history. Because the way the world found out about El Marino, about Los Exiliados, about all of this, wasn't through a police press conference. It wasn't through a court case. It wasn't through some journalist breaking a story. It was through hackers. In late 2022, a hacktivist collective calling themselves Guacamaya, named after a type of colorful parrot, pulled off one of the most extraordinary cyber attacks in Mexican history. They hacked directly into the servers of the Secretaría de la Defensa Nacional, Mexico's Ministry of Defense, known as SEDENA, and they didn't just steal a few documents. They got 6 terabytes of data. 6 terabytes. We're talking millions of emails, classified intelligence reports, internal communications, surveillance data, the entire internal communication system of Mexico's military laid bare. And when those documents started getting published and analyzed, one of the things that came out was a classified report titled Objetivos, Targets, dated August 2022. This was an internal email chain between an active Mexican army commander in Colima and a colleague in Mexico City, and the report listed 6 maximum priority targets for Mexican security forces. 6 people the military considered the most urgent threats. 6 people they were actively trying to track down and neutralize. El Marino's name was on that list. His full name, his alias, his photo, his base of operations. Right there in a top-secret military document, sandwiched between members of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, El Mencho's crew, and other major figures in the Mexican criminal world. Let me put that in perspective. The CJNG is considered by the United States government to be one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the planet. El Mencho, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, is arguably the most wanted drug lord in Mexico right now, with a $10 million bounty on his head from the US. And El Marino is sitting on that same list. A man who most people had never heard of. A man who had broken away from the Sinaloa cartel not even a year earlier and already has the military so spooked that he's in their top 6. The leaked documents also identified El Marino's group, Los Exiliados, alongside the CJNG and another group called Los Mezcales, as one of the primary forces driving a massive wave of violence across Colima and Jalisco. Colima, by the way, has consistently ranked as one of the most dangerous states in all of Mexico on a per capita basis, more violent than almost anywhere else in the country. And according to Mexican military intelligence, El Marino and his crew were a significant part of why. Think about the audacity of this move. You're El Marino. You've been inside the Sinaloa cartel. You know how El Mayo operates. You know the protocols, the networks, the people. You know the port operations in Manzanillo. You know the routes, the contacts, the safe houses. And instead of just riding that out, you decide to take all of that institutional knowledge and weaponize it for your own organization. You're essentially starting a competitor business using insider information from the most powerful criminal enterprise in the Western Hemisphere. That is either the boldest move anyone has ever made or the dumbest, depending on how it plays out. And the fact that by 2022, within what appears to be a relatively short time after breaking away, El Marino has already made Mexico's military top 6 most wanted list, that tells you it's working. That tells you Los Exiliados are not some small-time street gang. They're a real operation with real reach, real firepower, and real strategic value in one of the most contested drug territories in the country. But here's the other piece of this that doesn't get talked about enough. The Guacamaya leaks didn't just reveal El Marino, they revealed something much darker about the entire ecosystem he operates in. The same hack that exposed El Marino also exposed a stunning fact: that on May 31st, 2019, an active member of the Mexican military allegedly offered 70 hand grenades to an operator of a criminal organization at roughly $1,300 each. 8 of those grenades were reportedly paid for and delivered. Let that sink in. The same military that is hunting El Marino, that has him on a top-secret most wanted list. Elements inside that same military are allegedly selling weapons to the cartels. This is the world El Marino came from. This is the world he operates in. A world where the line between the state and the criminal organization is so blurred that sometimes you genuinely cannot tell which side is which. A former naval officer who deserted and went to the cartel. Military commanders selling grenades to criminal groups. Classified intelligence documents stolen by hackers and published online. This isn't fiction. This is Mexico in 2022. This is the world El Marino helped create, and the world he's now trying to survive in as an independent operator. Now let's talk about what comes next, because by the time the Guacamaya leaks exposed El Marino to the public, the broader situation in the Sinaloa cartel was getting absolutely chaotic, and El Marino, as a former insider, as someone who knew both El Mayo's operation and the port infrastructure in Manzanillo, was sitting in an extremely dangerous position. On one side, you've got El Mayo's faction, the Maiza, who El Marino used to be loyal to, but is now broken away from. On the other side, you've got Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, who are increasingly aggressive and willing to do whatever it takes to consolidate power. And in the middle, you've got the CJNG, Mencho's people, who are trying to expand their own footprint in Colima and Jalisco, directly competing with everyone else for control of Manzanillo. Now remember, El Marino's entire operation is based out of Manzanillo, that port, that specific geography. He's not in some neutral territory. He's in the middle of one of the most contested drug corridors in the entire country, surrounded by 3 organizations that each have reasons to want him gone. The Maiza might see him as a traitor who took their operational knowledge and used it against them. Los Chapitos might see him as a loose end from their father's era, and the CJNG definitely sees him as just another obstacle between them and control of the port. So how does El Marino survive? This is where his military training becomes invaluable again, because military operators, especially intelligence-adjacent ones like a driver and escort for a regional commander, they're trained to think about security, counterintelligence, how to move without being predictable, how to avoid patterns, how to structure an organization so that if one part gets compromised, the whole thing doesn't fall. These are skills the average cartel boss just doesn't have. And you can see that intelligence thinking in how Los Exiliados structured themselves. According to the leaked military documents, El Marino's group was described as having carved out its own specific operational territory in Colima, separate from, but overlapping with the major cartel's zones. It wasn't a frontal challenge. It was more surgical than that, finding the gaps, the spaces the bigger organizations weren't fully controlling, and filling them, working the angles. Meanwhile, on the legal side, the Mexican government had him in their crosshairs. The military intelligence apparatus, SEDINA, had him flagged as a top priority. But there's a fundamental problem with going after someone like El Marino in Colima. Remember those leaked documents about military personnel selling grenades to cartels? That problem didn't start or end with one incident. The penetration of Mexican security forces by cartel money is systemic, and a man who used to work for the naval commander of the region knows exactly which officials to pay and which ones to avoid. According to intelligence reports, El Marino was operating fairly openly in Manzanillo, even after the leaks. Not recklessly, but openly enough that the military intelligence people knew where he was. They put it in their documents. But knowing where someone is and actually arresting them in cartel-controlled territory are two very different things. And that's the broader consequence of what El Marino represents. The Guacamaya leaks listed him alongside 66 members of various criminal organizations active in Colima and Jalisco, who were identified as generators of violence. 66 people. And the list included an ex-federal police agent, a former municipal public security secretary, and others with deep ties to government institutions. The violence in Colima that El Marino and groups like his are connected to has made it one of the deadliest places in the world for years running. Regular people, families, business owners, people just trying to get through the day, are caught in the crossfire of these territorial wars. That's the human cost. That's what gets lost when we just talk about the criminal strategy and the wild story of El Marino's rise. The port city of Manzanillo, where he's operating, is home to hundreds of thousands of regular people. The synthetic drug precursors moving through that port are feeding the fentanyl crisis that's killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. The violence from the cartel wars in Colima is displacing communities, terrorizing families, and making normal life nearly impossible for people who have nothing to do with any of this. And El Marino, trained by the Mexican Navy, elevated by El Mayo, now running his own piece of that machine, is one of the men who makes that system work. That's the real story here. Now, on the streets, the question everybody's asking in Colima and Manzanillo is, how long can Los Exiliados survive? Because the history of cartel splinter groups going independent is not exactly full of happy endings. The Beltran Leyva brothers broke off from the Sinaloa cartel. Arturo Beltran Leyva was killed in a military raid in 2009. The remnants of their organization fragmented and got absorbed. The Juarez cartel pushed back against Sinaloa and lost. Even the mighty Zetas, who at their peak controlled huge swaths of Mexico and were widely considered the most militarized cartel in the country, ended up collapsing and fracturing. The pattern is clear. When you go up against the established giants of Mexican organized crime without some serious advantage, it usually ends badly. And El Marino, as brilliant as his move might seem in theory, is going up against not just one established giant, but potentially three. The Maiza, Los Chapitos, the CJNG. Any one of those organizations individually has more resources, more manpower, and more established infrastructure than Los Exiliados. So what's his angle? What's the play? The best bet, and this is reading between the lines of the intelligence reports, is that El Marino is leveraging the chaos of the Sinaloa cartel's internal war to make himself useful to multiple parties at once. The split between El Mayo and Los Chapitos has created a vacuum in certain operational areas. Los Exiliados, operating out of Manzanillo, could potentially be playing multiple sides, moving product for whoever pays, maintaining the port operations as a neutral hub that any faction can use for a cut. That's the chess move if it works. Position yourself as infrastructure rather than as a combatant. Be the person who controls the port, who knows the operations, who can move product regardless of who's fighting whom at the top. In cartel logic, that's the kind of position that can actually protect you, because you become more valuable alive than dead. So what does the story of El Marino actually mean? What does it tell us about the world we're living in right now? Here's the thing that I think is the most important takeaway from this entire story. El Marino is not an anomaly, he's a symptom. The Mexican Navy and military have been on the front lines of the drug war for decades. Mexican soldiers and Marines have conducted thousands of operations against cartels. They've captured El Chapo twice. They've taken down major cartel figures, and yet the drug trade has only gotten more sophisticated, more embedded, and more lethal. Why? In part because of exactly what happened with El Marino. Talented, disciplined, trained military personnel are being pulled into the cartel world, sometimes through corruption, sometimes through desperation, sometimes through threats to their families. And when they cross over, they bring everything they learned with them. This is the same story as Los Zetas, which the documents about El Marino explicitly referenced. Los Zetas were founded by GAF, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, members, elite special forces soldiers. When they crossed over to the Gulf Cartel and eventually went independent, they transformed the entire nature of cartel violence in Mexico. They introduced military-grade tactics, discipline, and organization to criminal warfare, and the bloodshed that followed was catastrophic. El Marino is operating on a smaller scale than the Zetas founders did, but the pattern is identical. Military training, inside knowledge, cartel connection, independent breakaway. And he's doing it at a moment when the two biggest factions of the most powerful cartel in the world, the Mayo and Los Chapitos, are at each other's throats. The Guacamaya leaks revealed that this internal Sinaloa war was already fueling unprecedented violence in multiple states by 2022. By July 2024, that war exploded into the open when El Mayo himself was arrested in El Paso, Texas, allegedly lured there under false pretenses by none other than Joaquin Guzman Lopez, El Chapo's own son. El Mayo, who had evaded capture for over 30 years, caught in what many described as a setup from inside his own world. Think about what that moment means for El Marino, the man he was loyal to, the man who trusted him most, the man whose operation he helped run, is now sitting in federal custody in the United States, facing trial in Brooklyn. The Sinaloa cartel has been decapitated at both its historical leadership positions within the span of a few years. El Chapo, life sentence. El Mayo, arrested and eventually pleading guilty in 2025. The two founders, gone. That creates an enormous power vacuum. And power vacuums in the cartel world don't stay empty for long. They get filled, violently. The question now is who fills them. Los Chapitos are positioning themselves. The CJNG is pushing hard, and somewhere in Manzanillo, according to the last available intelligence, El Marino and Los Exiliados are still out there. For the United States, this story matters enormously. The fentanyl crisis is not abstract. It's killing over 70,000 Americans every year, and Manzanillo, El Marino's operational base, is one of the key ports through which Chinese chemical precursors enter Mexico to be processed into fentanyl and shipped north. Every conversation about the fentanyl crisis, every political argument about border security, every headline about overdose deaths, there's a thread that runs from all of that back to places like Manzanillo, to operations like Los Exiliados, to figures like El Marino. He's not a movie villain. He's not some larger-than-life narco with a private zoo and a custom jet. He's something more interesting and more dangerous than that. He's an operator, a military-trained, cartel-elevated, now independent operator who understands logistics, security, and power in a way that most people in his world simply don't. He took everything the Mexican Navy taught him. He took everything El Mayo showed him. And he used it to build something for himself in the middle of the most violent drug corridor in North America, surrounded by enemies on every side. Is he still out there? Based on all available information as of the time of this video, yes. He hasn't been captured. He hasn't been confirmed dead. He's still on Mexico's priority list, which means the story of El Marino is not a story that's finished. It's a story that's still unfolding. And that, for real, is what makes him one of the most dangerous and fascinating figures in the entire world of organized crime right now. Not the biggest, not the most famous, but maybe, just maybe, the most interesting. Because while everyone was watching El Chapo's trial and tracking El Mayo's decades-long disappearing act and following Los Chapitos' rise to power, El Marino was moving quietly, under the radar, building something, in the port, in the dark, the way a former naval operator does it. No headlines, no flamboyance, just the work. That's El Marino.